A greedy son sold his mother's car and sent her to live in a small basement. Years later, he discovered that she was the owner of the building. Alice Morgan had dedicated her entire life to her son Samuel, seeing in him not only her reason for living, but also a promise for the future. After losing her husband Mark in a tragic accident when Samuel was only 5, Alice vowed never to let her son lack anything, even if it meant sacrificing every part of herself. With a simple job as a seamstress, Alice tirelessly fought to maintain their home, a small apartment in an old building in the city centre. Although modest, it was filled with memories and love. Samuel grew up surrounded by love, but also with a constant feeling of not belonging to that humble world. From a young age, he avoided inviting friends over out of embarrassment and dreamed of a life filled with luxuries different from his mother's. As he grew older, the differences between them became more apparent. Alice tried to teach him the value of hard work and honesty, but Samuel only felt disdain for the simple life they led. In her own way, Alice understood that desire for advancement, but it pained her to see her son emotionally distancing himself from her. When Samuel turned 25, Alice decided to give him a very special gift, his late father's vintage car. That vehicle was much more than just a means of transportation. It was a symbol of Mark's sacrifice, who had worked for years to buy it and provide a small luxury for his family amid many hardships. For Alice, handing over that car to Samuel wasn't just a present, but a way to keep alive the memory of his father and instill the importance of the sacrifices they had made for him. Hoping Samuel would appreciate the gesture, she handed him the keys with a smile full of nostalgia and love. But Samuel didn't feel the same way. To him, the car was just an outdated piece that didn't fit with his ambition to appear successful. Without a second thought, and without telling Alice, he sold it to get quick cash. With the money in hand, he rented a small apartment in an upscale neighborhood, the first step toward the life he had always dreamed of. He surrounded himself with superficial friends who valued appearances, young people who shared his desire to live without worries, spending recklessly and mocking those who couldn't keep up. Alice found out about the car sale days later when she went to the garage and discovered the empty space. The emptiness was not just physical, she felt it in her heart. The disappointment was profound, but instead of reproaching her son, she chose to remain silent. Despite the pain, she tried to convince herself that Samuel was still young and that, over time, he would learn to appreciate what truly mattered. However, that sale was just the beginning of a long chain of selfish decisions by Samuel. Little by little, the relationship between mother and son became more distant. Samuel avoided Alice's visits, considering them a burden. Each time she tried to reach out, he rejected her with vague excuses, caught up in his new life filled with parties and luxuries. Alice's love remained intact, but every time she looked at the corners of their apartment filled with memories of her husband and son, she felt an increasing emptiness. She knew Samuel was drifting away from her, not only from her, but also from everything that had once been their home and their story. One evening, Alice prepared a small dinner in the apartment to try to reconnect with Samuel. She spent hours cooking his favorite childhood dishes, hoping the aroma of home-cooked food would remind him of the happy moments they had shared. However, when Samuel arrived, his expression of annoyance was evident. He barely glanced at the lovingly set table and said he couldn't stay long. Alice tried to smile, even though inside she felt her heart breaking. Samuel quickly excused himself, leaving the meal behind and his mother with tears in her eyes. That night, Alice realized that something deeper was happening with her son. It wasn't just ambition that was driving him away. It was also a silent shame about his origins. Samuel wanted to escape the past, the humble life that Alice had fought so hard to build. But what hurt Alice the most wasn't that her son dreamed of a better future, but that he despised the life they had shared, as if the sacrifices she had made held no value. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions for Alice. On one hand, she still loved her son unconditionally. On the other, she began to realize that he would never be the man she had hoped for. Samuel was no longer that little boy who hugged his mother tenderly. He was now a young man who looked upon his family history with disdain. Disappointment mingled with hope, and Alice wondered if there would ever be a way to reclaim the son she loved so much. As months passed, the relationship between Alice and Samuel grew colder and more distant. Each of Alice's attempts to get closer to her son was met with indifference or evasions. Samuel had stopped seeing her as his mother. To him, she was a shadow of the past he was trying to leave behind. Meanwhile, the luxuries he enjoyed thanks to the money from the car sale became a constant need. He wanted more designer clothes, more exclusive parties, more friends with whom to pretend to lead a successful life. But maintaining that facade was expensive, and he soon realized he needed a new source of money to keep going. That's when Samuel devised his next plan. The apartment where he had grown up wasn't particularly valuable, but it represented everything Alice had worked hard for over the years. To Samuel, it was nothing more than an obstacle reminding him of a life he wanted to forget. He knew that selling it would not only provide him with a substantial sum of money, but also allow him to sever ties with a past he was ashamed of. However, he also knew that Alice would never sell the apartment on her own initiative. He needed to convince her. With a smile that disguised his true intentions, Samuel visited Alice for the first time in weeks. He found her in the kitchen, quietly sewing as she had so many times before. He hugged her with an unusual warmth, and Alice felt a flicker of hope seeing her son so close. During dinner, Samuel began to talk to her about his future plans. He told her he wanted to invest in a business that would provide stability for both of them, a business that would change their lives forever. Alice listened intently, feeling a silent pride, thinking that maybe her son was finally taking a responsible path. Then, in a soft and persuasive voice, Samuel proposed selling the apartment. He assured her it was only a temporary sacrifice, that he would use the money to start a business, and soon they could move to a better place. Alice, although worried, wanted to believe him. For years, she had dreamed of seeing her son prosper, and if selling the apartment could help him achieve that dream, perhaps it was a sacrifice worth making. Still, the decision wasn't easy. That house was not just a physical place. It was the refuge where she had raised her son, where she had kept the memories of her husband, and where, despite the hardships, she had found moments of happiness. Samuel looked at her with pleading eyes, as if waiting for her to understand that this was for her own good. Alice, with a heart torn, decided to trust her son one more time. She told herself that he was trying to do something positive, that perhaps selling the apartment would give Samuel the boost he needed to succeed. Through tears, she signed the sale papers, feeling each stroke of the pen tear a piece of her soul away. When she handed the keys to Samuel, she asked him not to forget that this place had been their home, and that no matter where they were, they would always have a home together. Samuel hugged her briefly, but he was already thinking about the next step. With the sale money in his hands, it didn't take long for him to show his true plan. Instead of investing in the business he had promised his mother, he spent most of it on clothes, exclusive events, and dinners at expensive restaurants. He surrounded himself with people who admired his apparent success, and for a time, he felt that he had finally become part of the life he had always desired. However, that success was fleeting, and the funds began to dwindle quickly. Samuel found himself trapped in a cycle of uncontrolled spending, desperately trying to maintain appearances in front of his new friends. Meanwhile, Alice moved to a small apartment in the basement of the same building where she had lived her entire life. The space was dark and damp, with bare walls and barely a small window that let in little light. It was a place that reflected the loneliness and abandonment she felt in her heart. Despite the humiliation, Alice did not complain. She accepted her new reality with the same dignity with which she had faced all the difficulties in her life. She took her old sewing machine and a few personal belongings, the few things of value she had left. From her corner in the basement, Alice tried to keep busy. She started sewing clothes for the neighbors in the building, barely earning enough to buy basic food items. Each stitch was a way to stay connected to the outside world, a way to resist. Samuel's visits became even more sporadic. When he did show up, it was only to ask for more money or to reproach her for not understanding the difficulties he faced as an entrepreneur. Every word he spoke was like a stab to her heart, but Alice bore the pain in silence. She loved her son and hoped deep down that one day he would realize the harm he was causing her. As Samuel continued to squander the money in his attempts to maintain his lifestyle, Alice spent her days in solitude, sitting by the small window in her basement, watching the passage of time through a faint ray of light. She had lost her home, but she had not lost her hope. She knew that somehow she would find a way to move forward. What she didn't foresee was that the true change in her life was about to begin, though not in the way she had hoped. From her small basement apartment, Alice began to build a new routine. The first few weeks were tough. The cold seeped through the bare walls, and humidity permeated every corner. However, Alice refused to be defeated by her circumstances. With her sewing machine and a small basket of old fabrics, she began offering her services to the building's neighbors. At first, these were small jobs: hemming pants, mending worn shirts, and sewing simple curtains. Gradually, tenants began to seek her out, not only for the quality of her work, but also for the kindness with which she treated them. Every customer who knocked on her door found in Alice not just a seamstress, but a woman who listened with empathy and offered words of encouragement. Even though Alice had been relegated to the basement by her own son, she never stopped helping those around her. Thomas, the building superintendent, was one of the few who knew the true story behind her move. With respect and affection, he made it a point to visit her regularly, bringing small groceries or helping her carry the clothes she needed to deliver to her neighbors. "Don't worry, Mrs. Alice," he always said with a kind smile. "As long as I'm here, you'll never be alone." Marta, a single mother living on the 4th floor, also became a close friend. Shouldering the responsibility of raising 2 young children while working 2 jobs, Marta found in Alice an unconditional support. On more than one occasion, the older woman had watched her children so Marta could rest, and in return, Marta often brought her homemade dinners to share. This small support network became Alice's emotional anchor, a reminder that even though she had lost so much, there was still goodness in her life. Throughout this time, Samuel continued to appear sporadically in the building. His visits were brief and laden with arrogance. He wore expensive clothing, always accompanied by an air of superiority that made the neighbors look at him with disdain. Each time he passed by the basement, he didn't even stop to greet his mother. It was as if Alice had ceased to exist for him. Samuel's indifference hurt more than any cruel word. Yet, Alice held on to the hope that one day her son would awaken from the illusion in which he lived. It was amidst this routine that Alice's life changed with the arrival of a new tenant in the building, Henry Sullivan. He was a 35-year-old man with a calm and serene presence. Unlike the other residents, he didn't seem interested in flaunting his status. Henry had rented an apartment on the 2nd floor, seeking a place to reorganize his life after a complicated legal conflict that had affected his business. His goal was to find peace and stability, and the old building seemed the perfect refuge for that. At first, Henry didn't pay much attention to Alice. To him, she was just another elderly woman in the building, someone who went unnoticed among the other tenants. However, one rainy afternoon, as he was climbing the stairs with a heavy bag of laundry, he saw her struggling to keep her balance. Without a second thought, he approached to help her. Alice, surprised by the gesture, accepted his assistance with a slight nod, avoiding eye contact. Despite the initial discomfort, this small act of kindness marked the beginning of something unexpected. From that day on, Henry began to notice Alice more. He saw her every morning, sitting by the small window in the basement, sewing quietly, or greeting passing neighbors with a shy smile. There was something about her presence that sparked his curiosity, a combination of dignity and sadness, as if she carried an invisible weight on her shoulders. Intrigued, Henry began to discreetly ask other tenants about her. It was during a casual conversation with Thomas that Henry learned the truth about Alice. The superintendent, with the discretion he was known for, explained how Samuel had sold the family home and forced his mother to live in that small basement. Henry listened attentively, feeling a mix of compassion and anger. He couldn't understand how someone could treat their own mother that way, especially after all she had sacrificed. As the weeks passed, Henry started looking for more opportunities to interact with Alice. He discreetly left money in her shopping bag or requested sewing jobs he didn't need, presenting them as favors for friends. At first, Alice was cautious, unsure of the kind intentions of this kind man. However, over time, she began to open up to him, sensing in Henry a genuine kindness she hadn't experienced in a long time. Henry quickly noticed the stark difference between Alice and her son. While Samuel despised his mother and relegated her to obscurity, Henry saw in Alice a strong woman capable of finding beauty and purpose amidst adversity. Every small act of kindness he performed for her felt like a way to compensate for the absence of his own mother, whom he had lost at a young age. Unbeknownst to either of them, the bond beginning to form between them would change their lives forever. Henry began to visit the basement more naturally. He always found some excuse to see Alice, whether it was to pick up a suit for a friend that needed adjustments or to leave her some groceries he claimed were leftovers. Although Alice was initially distrustful of these gestures, she eventually accepted them with gratitude. Over time, she started to share more with him, recounting snippets of her life, like the love stories she lived with her late husband, Mark, or the happy memories of the early years with Samuel when he was still a hopeful child with simple dreams. One rainy afternoon, while Henry sat on the small bench by the entrance of the basement, Alice felt she could trust him like she hadn't with anyone in years. In hushed tones, she revealed a secret that even Samuel didn't know. Mark, before passing away, had left a small inheritance from his savings and a life insurance policy. Alice had kept that money a secret, fearing that her son would squander it. Her intention had been to use it to help Samuel when he truly needed it, but over time, seeing the direction her son's life was taking, she decided to keep it as an emergency resource. Henry listened intently, understanding the magnitude of Alice's sacrifice and the pain she had endured in silence. That money wasn't just a monetary sum, it was the last link that connected Alice to her deceased husband and the only resource that gave her some sense of security in an increasingly uncertain world. Henry couldn't bear the thought of such a dignified and generous woman continuing to live in the shadows because of her son's greed. With a mix of determination and gentleness, Henry proposed an idea: to use that money to regain some control over her life. At first, Alice didn't fully grasp what he meant. Then, he explained that they could start buying small shares from the building's owners. If they managed to acquire enough shares, not only would they regain some financial stability, but they could also ensure that Samuel would never have power over her life again. Alice listened to the proposal cautiously, but also with growing curiosity. The possibility of regaining control over something in her life was tempting, though it also scared her. She had never seen herself as a businesswoman and wasn't sure if she could handle such transactions. However, Henry, with his experience and contacts, assured her that he would guide her through every step of the process. It would be a quiet investment, made discreetly, so that Samuel would never suspect what was happening. As the weeks went by, Alice and Henry began to set their plan into motion. They started by contacting some of the building's owners who were willing to sell their shares at affordable prices. Henry handled the negotiations, while Alice oversaw each transaction with a mix of nervousness and excitement. For the first time in a long time, she felt she was reclaiming a part of herself, that part Samuel had tried to take from her. Although the transactions were small, each one represented another step toward independence. Meanwhile, Alice became more involved in the building's life. She did so not as an owner, but as a concerned neighbor looking out for everyone's well-being. She listened to tenants' complaints, helped resolve minor conflicts, and quietly financed small repairs. She did this without drawing attention, ensuring that no one knew she was behind the changes. Little by little, she became a respected figure among the neighbors, a silent leader who, from her small basement, was starting to transform the building's life. Henry also devoted more time to being near Alice, not just as an ally in investments, but as a friend and confidant. Their conversations grew deeper and more personal. Henry shared with her about his lonely childhood, his career as an entrepreneur, and the struggles he faced after his mother's death. Alice, in turn, told him about the dreams she had shared with Mark and the pain of watching her son drift away. As they shared their stories, they both realized they had found in each other something they hadn't had in a long time, a genuine connection based on trust and respect. The bond between Alice and Henry grew stronger with each passing day as they continued to secretly acquire shares in the building. With every share purchased, Alice felt she was reclaiming a part of her lost dignity. Although she still lived in the basement, she no longer felt like a prisoner. She knew she was building something greater, something that would give her control over her life, and perhaps finally allow her to break free from Samuel's shadow. However, there was still much work to be done. Henry and Alice knew they needed to act cautiously to prevent Samuel from discovering what they were doing. The transformation of the building and the recovery of her independence was a slow and meticulous process, but both were willing to press on. Each small advance represented a quiet victory, a sign that the control Samuel had exercised over Alice's life was crumbling. Henry began to frequent the basement with more ease. He always found some excuse to visit Alice, whether it was to pick up a suit for a friend that needed adjustments or to leave her some groceries he claimed were leftovers. Although Alice was initially wary of these gestures, she eventually accepted them with gratitude. Over time, she started to share more with him, recounting snippets of her life, like the love stories she had lived with her late husband Mark, or the happy memories of the early years with Samuel, when he was still a hopeful child with simple dreams. One rainy afternoon, as Henry sat on the small bench by the entrance of the basement, Alice felt she could trust him like she hadn't with anyone in years. In whispers, she revealed a secret that even Samuel didn't know. Mark, before his death, had left a small inheritance from his savings and a life insurance policy. Alice had kept that money a secret, fearing that her son would squander it. Her intention had been to use it to help Samuel when he truly needed it. But over time, seeing the direction his life was taking, she decided to keep it as an emergency resource. Henry listened to every word attentively, understanding the magnitude of Alice's sacrifice and the pain she had endured in silence. That money wasn't just a monetary sum. It was the last link connecting Alice to her deceased husband and the only resource that provided her with a sense of security in an increasingly uncertain world. Henry couldn't bear the thought of such a dignified and generous woman continuing to live in the shadows because of her son's greed. With a mix of determination and delicacy, Henry proposed an idea: to use that money to regain some control over her life. At first, Alice didn't fully understand what he meant. Then he explained that they could start buying small shares from the building's owners. If they managed to acquire enough shares, not only would they regain some financial stability, but they could also ensure that Samuel would never again have power over her life. Alice listened to the proposal cautiously, but also with growing curiosity. The possibility of regaining control over something in her life was tempting, though it also scared her. She had never seen herself as a businesswoman and wasn't sure if she could handle such transactions. However, Henry, with his experience and contacts, assured her that he would guide her through every step of the process. It would be a quiet investment, made discreetly, so that Samuel would never suspect what was happening. As the weeks went by, Alice and Henry began to put their plan into action. They started by contacting some of the building's owners who were willing to sell their shares at affordable prices. Henry handled the negotiations, while Alice oversaw each transaction with a mix of nervousness and excitement. For the first time in a long time, She felt she was reclaiming a part of herself, that part Samuel had tried to take from her. Although the transactions were small, each one represented another step toward independence. Meanwhile, Alice began to involve herself more in the life of the building. She did so not as an owner, but as a concerned neighbor, looking out for everyone's well-being. She listened to tenants' complaints, helped resolve minor conflicts, and quietly financed small repairs. She did this without drawing attention, ensuring that no one knew she was behind the changes. Little by little, she became a respected figure among the neighbors, a silent leader who, from her small basement, was starting to transform the life of the building. Henry also spent more time with Alice, not just as an ally in the investments, but as a friend and confidant. Their conversations grew deeper and more personal. Henry shared with her about his lonely childhood, his career as an entrepreneur, and the challenges he faced after his mother's death. Alice, in turn, spoke of the dreams she had shared with Mark and the pain of watching her son drift away from her. As they shared their stories, they both realized they had found in each other something they hadn't had in a long time, a genuine connection based on trust and respect. The bond between Alice and Henry strengthened with each passing day as they continued to secretly acquire shares in the building. With every share purchased, Alice felt she was reclaiming a part of her lost dignity. Although she still lived in the basement, she no longer felt like a prisoner. She knew she was building something greater, something that would give her control over her life, and perhaps finally allow her to break free from Samuel's shadow. However, there was still much work to be done. Henry and Alice knew they needed to act cautiously to prevent Samuel from discovering what they were doing. The transformation of the building and the recovery of her independence was a slow and meticulous process, but both were willing to move forward. Each small advance represented a quiet victory, a sign that the control Samuel had exercised over Alice's life was crumbling. Samuel continued to immerse himself in a lifestyle that, although it seemed bright from the outside, was beginning to collapse rapidly. The parties, extravagant dinners, and compulsive shopping maintained his image of success, but expenses far exceeded his income. What remained from the money from the apartment sale was dwindling at an alarming rate, and more, Samuel depended on loans and favors to keep up appearances. His friends, those who surrounded him for convenience, began to distance themselves like vultures leaving a carcass once it had nothing left to offer. The calls from creditors became increasingly insistent, and banks were starting to deny him new loans. Samuel tried to show no signs of weakness, but inside, fear and desperation began to consume him. In the social circles he aspired to belong to, failure was not an option. Every event he attended felt like a constant test, as if a single slip could cause him to fall into the oblivion of high society that he longed for. While Samuel struggled to maintain his facade, things in the building took a completely different turn. Henry and Alice pressed on with their plan, discreetly acquiring shares and making significant improvements. The building, which had been neglected for years, began to transform under Alice's quiet management. Common areas were remodeled, hallway lights were replaced with new ones that warmly illuminated the space, and the dilapidated walls received a fresh coat of paint. Additionally, new services were installed for the tenants: a small gym, a community room, and play areas for children. Alice actively participated in every detail of the renovation, supervising the work from the shadows. Even though she still lived in the basement, each improvement represented for her a step toward freedom, a way to regain control over her life. The neighbors, although unaware that Alice was behind these changes, began to see her as an important figure in the community. The elderly woman who had been relegated to the basement was slowly becoming the heart of the building. For his part, Henry ensured that the transactions remained discreet. With his business experience, he knew how to handle the paperwork so that the shares were registered without raising suspicion. Each share purchased was a silent victory, and both delighted in seeing Samuel's power over the building crumble without him even noticing. What had once been a prison for Alice was now becoming her stronghold. Meanwhile, Samuel remained convinced that he still had some control over the building. His pride and indifference kept him away from administrative matters, trusting that his ownership status would remain intact. However, the renovations did not go unnoticed by him. One day, while visiting the building, he noticed changes in the lobby and common areas. The repainted walls, the new lights, and the overall modernization confused him. Who was behind all this? When he asked Thomas, the superintendent, about the improvements, Thomas responded with an enigmatic smile. "It's the work of the new owners," he said without elaborating. Samuel felt perplexed. He didn't understand how someone could make decisions about the building without consulting him, but he was so absorbed in his own spiral of financial troubles that he chose to ignore it. After all, he believed he still had control over most of the shares. The reality, however, was very different. Alice and Henry had already accumulated a significant stake, and although they hadn't made their new position public, they were about to surpass half of the building's shares. Every time Samuel sold a portion of his holdings to get quick cash, he unknowingly strengthened his mother's position. What he saw as a simple transaction was becoming the final nail in his power. The turning point came when, in a desperate attempt to pay an urgent debt, Samuel sold the remainder of his shares to anonymous buyers without even checking who they were. He believed he had made a good deal, convinced that he could regain control later. What he didn't know was that his mother, along with Henry, had acquired more than 50% of the building. With that final transaction, Alice became the majority owner of the place Samuel had so despised. As Samuel silently celebrated the sale, convinced he had momentarily solved his problems, things in the building continued to change. Alice and Henry, with the majority control in their hands, began to implement further renovations. The basement where Alice lived was also renovated, although she chose to keep her space modest. She didn't need luxuries. What she valued most was the sense of freedom and control she had regained. However, Alice decided to keep her new position a secret a little longer. She wanted to wait for the right moment to confront her son, but also wanted to give him time to reflect on his decisions. She knew Samuel was trapped in a cycle of ambition and superficiality, and while it pained her to see him like this, she also understood that he needed to hit rock bottom before he could change. As the building prospered, Samuel continued his downward spiral. The luxuries he once enjoyed were fading rapidly, and the few friends he had left began to drift away. His girlfriend, Jessica, started showing signs of disinterest, frustrated by Samuel's financial instability. Every day was a constant struggle to maintain appearances, but even he knew that the facade he had built was beginning to crumble. With debts pressing down on him and no one else to turn to, Samuel decided to return to the building to ask his mother for help. He wasn't doing it out of regret, but out of desperation. He believed Alice still had some small savings and that he could manipulate her once more to get what he needed. However, upon arriving at the building, he found a place he hardly recognized. Samuel arrived at the building on the verge of despair. He barely recognized the place he had abandoned months ago. The lobby, which used to be in ruins with peeling walls and a cracked floor, now shone with elegance. Warm lights illuminated every corner, and instead of the old, neglected counter, there was a modern desk with a perfectly organized reception. The air smelled clean, as if every space had been renewed. Everything looked so different that for a moment, Samuel wondered if he was in the right place. He hurried over to the reception desk, where a new security guard greeted him, with a polite but distant expression. "Name?" asked the guard, checking a list on a tablet. Samuel, offended by the formality, replied in a haughty tone, "I am Samuel Morgan, the owner of this building." The guard, without looking up, swiped his finger across the screen before responding calmly, "Your name does not appear on the owner's records here, sir." Samuel felt his blood boil. There must be a mistake. This building is mine. My mother lives here in the basement. Let me through. The guard observed him in silence for a moment, evaluating his authoritative tone. After a brief moment of hesitation, he sighed and decided to accompany him to the management office to avoid any problems. Samuel followed the guard through the hallways, feeling how each renovated corner of the building deepened his growing sense of confusion. Upon arriving at the office, Samuel stopped dead in his tracks. In front of him, in a bright space tastefully decorated, sat Henry Sullivan, comfortably behind a desk. Beside him, Alice, his mother, looked at him with a serene yet firm expression, as if she had been expecting him. Alice's transformation left him speechless. Although she still dressed simply, there was a renewed confidence in her posture, an authority Samuel had never seen before. The contrast between the hunched and submissive woman he had left in the basement and the Alice now before him was shocking. "What's going on here?" Samuel murmured, unable to hide his confusion. Henry looked up from the papers he was reviewing, observing him with a mix of pity and disdain, then turned his attention back to Alice as if Samuel were nothing more than an intruder. It was Alice who broke the silence with a calm voice, but loaded with meaning. "Son, this building no longer belongs to you." Samuel felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. "What do you mean?" he managed to articulate, with the wavering tone of someone who fears the answer. Alice leaned slightly back in her chair, intertwining her hands over her lap. "While you spent money on luxuries and pretended to live a life you couldn't sustain, we bought the shares of the building. Henry and I are the owners now." The impact of those words was devastating. Samuel, used to controlling the situation and manipulating his mother, couldn't comprehend how Alice had taken charge of her life without him realizing it. How could you do this to me?" he stammered, feeling that he was losing control. Alice looked at him with a mix of sadness and determination. "I didn't do it to hurt you, Samuel. I did it to reclaim what you took from me, my dignity and my freedom." Samuel tried to retort, but the words caught in his throat. Reality hit him like an unstoppable wave. His mother, the woman he had relegated to the basement, was now the owner of everything he had despised. Unable to bear the humiliation, he tried to appeal to Alice's compassion. "Please, Mom, I'm in a tough situation. I need your help. Give me something, anything." Alice watched him in silence for a few seconds that felt eternal. She could see the fear in her son's eyes, but she also knew that it wasn't enough to feel pity for him. Samuel had to learn what true sacrifice, humility, and effort meant. "I won't throw you out, Samuel," she finally said. "You can stay, in the same basement where you made me live. But this time, you'll have to work and prove that you can change." Samuel felt the humiliation wash over him completely. He knew he had no other option. Creditors were hounding him, his friends had abandoned him, and his only way out was to accept his mother's conditions. He nodded slowly, unable to look her in the eye. Alice rose from her seat with the grace of someone who had reclaimed her place in the world. "The basement is ready for you," she said softly, but with a firmness that left no room for discussion. The security guard escorted him to the basement, where Samuel found the same small, dark room in which his mother had lived for months. The space, although renovated, was still humble, without luxuries or comforts. Samuel fell onto the narrow bed, feeling for the first time the real weight of the decisions he had made. It was ironic that he was now in the same place he had condemned his mother to, but this time, without the hope of escaping easily. The following days were a harsh lesson for Samuel. Now he was under the supervision of Thomas, the superintendent, and Henry, who assigned him simple but essential tasks for the building's maintenance. At first, Samuel complied reluctantly, dragging his feet and silently complaining. However, he soon realized that he wouldn't receive any special treatment. Every poorly done task meant more work for him, and the glances from the tenants, laden with disdain, served as a constant reminder of his past mistakes. The work forced him to interact with the neighbors, and for the first time, he began to notice the details of their lives. He helped Marta, the single mother, carry her shopping bags. He listened to the stories of Don Agustin, an elderly man who had lived in the building for decades. He repaired bicycles for the children and fixed leaks in the apartments. Little by little, without even realizing it, he started to become involved in the community. Meanwhile, Henry watched him from a distance, vigilant but fair. He wasn't willing to make things easier for Samuel, but he also didn't want him to fail. He knew that true change had to come from within, and that's why every small effort he saw from Samuel was a step in the right direction. Alice also observed him from the shadows, without intervening. She knew her son still had much to learn, but each small act of kindness he performed was a sign that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for him. The basement had become Samuel's new reality. Without the luxury that had once surrounded him, and with the narrow walls seeming to close in on him, each day was an internal struggle to accept his situation. At first, his pride prevented him from genuinely engaging in the tasks assigned to him. He felt that his work, supervised by Thomas and Henry, was yet another humiliation, a sentence imposed by a mother who no longer saw him as the center of her life. However, over time, Samuel began to understand that he had no choice but to accept his new reality and face the consequences of his decisions. The days were filled with simple but exhausting tasks: cleaning the hallways, picking up trash, helping with small repairs, and carrying the neighbors' bags. Marta, the single mother, remained distant at first, distrustful of his sudden change. He didn't blame her. He knew the neighbors looked at him warily, remembering his arrogance and disdain for the community. However, as the days went by, small moments of genuine gratitude began to emerge. One morning, Samuel found Marta struggling to carry her children's backpacks and her own shopping bags at the same time. Without saying a word, he approached her and took the bags from her hands. Marta looked at him in surprise, perhaps expecting some sarcastic comment, but Samuel simply nodded and continued walking toward his apartment. That was the first time she briefly smiled at him, a small but significant gesture that made him feel he had perhaps taken a step in the right direction. Constant work began to shape him in unexpected ways. While helping Don Agustin down the stairs or fixing a bicycle wheel for the children in the building, Samuel started to notice details he had never seen before. He understood the difficulties the tenants faced day by day and began to see them not as inferior people, but as individuals with their own stories, full of struggle and sacrifice. For the first time in his life, he felt real empathy for others. This empathy hit him hard, like a truth he had been ignoring all his life. His mother had been the first person in his life to live this way, sacrificing herself without asking for anything in return. The tenants gradually began to accept his presence, although respect and trust did not come immediately. There were still wary glances and quiet comments as he passed through the hallways, but Samuel decided not to complain or retaliate. He knew he had earned that distrust, and that gaining the respect of others would be a long and painful process. Henry and Thomas observed him from a distance, without intervening too much. They wanted to see if his change was genuine or if it was just a temporary strategy to win back his mother's favor. One day, while cleaning the building's stairs, Samuel found himself face to face with Henry in the lobby. They looked at each other in silence for a moment, measuring each other's willingness. Finally, Henry broke the silence. "You know it won't be easy, right?" he said calmly but firmly. Samuel, instead of responding arrogantly, simply nodded. "I know," he murmured. It was in that moment that Henry began to see him in a new light. He was no longer the arrogant young man he had known, but someone starting to understand the weight of his mistakes. The real challenge came one night when an unexpected fire broke out in the building's boiler room. Smoke spread quickly through the hallways, causing panic among the tenants. Screams echoed in all directions as families tried to evacuate in a hurry. Samuel, who was in his small basement apartment, was one of the first to notice the flames. Without thinking of his own safety, he ran toward the stairs, banging on doors and shouting to alert the neighbors. Fear overwhelmed him, but his instinct was to act. He found Don Agustin trapped in his apartment, unable to make it down the stairs by himself. Without hesitation, Samuel lifted him onto his shoulders and carried him to the exit of the building. Then he ran back to help Marta, who was trying to calm her two children as the smoke filled the hallways. He scooped the kids up in his arms and guided them quickly toward the exit. Despite the chaos, Samuel stayed focused, making sure all the tenants were safe before thinking of his own safety. When the firefighters arrived and controlled the blaze, Samuel collapsed onto the sidewalk, exhausted and covered in soot. His chest heaved with difficulty, but a sense of relief enveloped him, knowing everyone was safe. The tenants began to approach him, some to thank him, others still surprised by his bravery. Marta looked him in the eyes and, for the first time, gave him a sincere smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. Samuel just nodded, unable to find words to respond. That night, sitting on the sidewalk alongside the other tenants, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. He didn't need recognition or praise. Knowing he had done the right thing was enough. However, what moved him the most was seeing his mother slowly approach. Alice looked at him with a mixture of sadness and hope, as if she were finally seeing the son she had raised all those years ago. Samuel lowered his gaze, unable to meet her understanding eyes. There were no words that could erase the damage he had caused, but there was a simple truth in that moment. For the first time in his life, he had acted selflessly, and that was a small step toward redemption. Alice moved closer, and without saying anything, extended her hand to him. Samuel, with trembling hands, took hers gently. It wasn't a complete forgiveness, but it was a beginning. The pressure of Alice's hand on his made him understand that although the path to reconciliation would be long and difficult, there was still hope. The basement became Samuel's permanent home, but not in the way he had imagined. At first, each day there was a painful reminder of his downfall, a symbol of the place he had relegated his mother to without remorse. Now, he lived under the same conditions she had endured, though without the same serenity and dignity with which Alice had faced those months of darkness. The narrow bed and the tiny window through which barely any light entered were his only company, along with the echoes of his own thoughts. However, something within Samuel began to change. The initial resentment toward his mother and his situation started to transform into something different: introspection. Each day was marked by tasks that demanded physical effort and patience. Under the watchful eyes of Thomas and Henry, Samuel carried out all kinds of jobs in the building. In the mornings, he swept the hallways, cleaned windows, and picked up trash. At first, he did it with annoyance, trying to do the bare minimum to get by. However, he soon realized that his attitude wouldn't get him anywhere. The tenants showed no leniency, and every time he failed in his work, Henry assigned him more tasks as a consequence. There was no room for shortcuts in this new world that Samuel was discovering. Over time, Samuel began to engage more in the small dynamics of the building. Helping Marta, the single mother, carry her groceries became a routine, and Marta's children began to approach him with curiosity, as if trying to understand who this man was, who had been a complete stranger until recently. Don Agustin, the elderly man with mobility issues, became a sort of mentor to Samuel. Each time he helped him down the stairs or brought him food, the old man would share anecdotes about the building's history and the changes he had seen over the years. Those conversations, far from being boring, awakened in Samuel a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. What surprised him the most was how the children of the building began to seek his help to fix their bicycles or repair broken toys. At first, Samuel thought they were simply nuisances, but gradually he realized that those moments were the most rewarding of his day. The grateful smiles of the children and the small conversations he had with them began to fill the void that had consumed him for so long. Henry and Alice watched these changes with caution. Henry was aware that Samuel's transformation couldn't be forced. It had to emerge naturally. That's why, while he kept a close watch on him, he avoided intervening too much. Alice, for her part, felt a mix of hope and sadness. She saw in her son small glimpses of the young man she had raised, but she also knew there was still a long way to go to heal the wounds of the past. One day, While Samuel was raking fallen leaves in the building's garden, Marta approached him with a steaming cup of coffee. "Here, this will do you good," she said with a shy smile. Samuel, surprised by the gesture, accepted the cup and looked at her intently for a moment. "Thank you," he murmured, feeling for the first time in a long while a genuine connection with someone. Marta sat down next to him on the edge of a planter, and for the first time she shared her life with him. She talked about the challenges of raising 2 children alone, the nights when she barely slept from working 2 jobs, and the importance that the building and its neighbors had in her life. Samuel listened in silence, understanding that while his problems had been significant, others had their own challenges. He wasn't alone in his struggle. Little by little, the tenants began to accept Samuel's presence, although there was still some wariness. Each day was a silent test of his commitment. When a neighbor had a problem, Samuel offered to help without expecting anything in return. He fixed leaking pipes, painted worn walls, and even organized a small game tournament for the building's children. In each small action, he strived to show that his change was real. One of the most revealing moments occurred during a community meeting that Alice and Henry organized to discuss future improvements for the building. All the tenants were present, and Samuel attended as well, although he sat in the last row, trying to remain unnoticed. During the meeting, a proposal arose to create an emergency fund for residents facing financial difficulties. To everyone's surprise, it was Samuel who raised his hand and offered to contribute the little money he had started to save. The silence that followed his proposal was thick. Tenants exchanged surprised glances, and some even doubted his sincerity. However, Marta was the first to break the silence. "If Samuel is willing to help, I think we should accept it," she said in a firm voice. That small show of trust was enough for the others to nod, albeit cautiously. For Samuel, that moment was a small triumph. Not only because his proposal had been accepted, but because he felt that he was finally beginning to earn a place in the community. As the weeks passed, Samuel realized that his perspective on life was changing. He no longer longed for the luxuries and ostentation that had once defined his existence. What he valued most now were the authentic relationships he was building with the neighbors and the satisfaction of knowing that each day he was doing something meaningful. For the first time in his life, he understood the true value of work and service to others. Alice, although maintaining some emotional distance, watched with pride the changes in her son. She knew the path to full reconciliation was still long, but seeing Samuel sincerely strive to be a better person was all she had ever wanted. Henry, for his part, also recognized Samuel's progress, although he continued to maintain his role as a mentor and supervisor. He knew there were still challenges ahead, and that true change was not a linear process. One afternoon, as Samuel finished cleaning the lobby, Alice approached him silently. She stood next to him, observing the work he had done. "You're doing well," she said softly, with no further explanation. Samuel, his heart full of emotions, nodded silently. They didn't need more words. He knew that small acknowledgement was a first step towards something greater. The path to Samuel's redemption was underway. Each day was a new opportunity to prove he was capable of change, not just in the eyes of others, but also in his own. Although there were still wounds to heal and challenges to overcome, for the first time in a long time, Samuel felt he was on the right path. The night of the fire remained etched in Samuel's mind as a turning point, but it was also just the beginning of a deeper process. Despite the expressions of gratitude from the tenants and the approving gaze of Henry and Alice, he knew that act of bravery wasn't enough to erase all the damage he had caused. True and lasting forgiveness would have to be earned day by day, step by step. Since that night, Samuel began to take each task more seriously and with commitment. He no longer did it just to redeem himself. He understood that his work had a real purpose, to care for the building he had ignored for so long and to serve the people he had once despised. However, despite his efforts, he knew not all the tenants had completely forgiven him. There were still glances that carried the memory of his arrogance, and Samuel accepted that reality with humility. He knew some wounds would take time to heal. Every day, his routine filled with responsibilities, but also meaningful moments. Helping Don Agustin became a ritual. Samuel would often spend afternoons talking with him after taking him to the nearby park for fresh air. Don Agustin, with his quiet wisdom, shared stories about the building's past, teaching Samuel the value of the community that his mother had been silently building for years. On the other hand, Marta and her children had become a sort of new family for Samuel. He began helping the children with their schoolwork and organized small games in the building's courtyard. Over time, Marta stopped seeing him as the arrogant young man he once was and began to see him as a man trying to rebuild his life from scratch. It was in those moments, surrounded by laughing children and grateful neighbors, that Samuel found a peace he had never experienced before. However, the true test of his transformation would come at an unexpected moment. One night, as Samuel was finishing his shift cleaning the basement, Henry stopped him in the lobby. "Tomorrow, city inspectors are coming to evaluate the building's new renovations," he informed him. "I need you to ensure everything is in order." The task was no small matter. It meant that Samuel had to supervise the common areas, emergency exits, and boilers to ensure they were in perfect condition. The slightest error could delay the permits they needed to finalize the renovations. Samuel accepted the responsibility without hesitation, knowing that Henry was trusting him. He spent the night checking every corner of the building, making sure no detail was left unresolved. For the tenants, he wasn't the hero of the situation. He was simply part of the team working hard to keep the building in good condition for everyone. That feeling of belonging, of being part of something larger than himself, gave him a purpose he hadn't known before. The next day, the inspectors arrived early in the morning. Samuel greeted them nervously, but with the conviction that he had done everything possible to ensure the evaluation went well. As he accompanied them through the hallways and the renovated areas, Alice and Henry watched from a distance. It was a key moment, not just for the building, but also for Samuel, who was finally showing he was capable of taking on important responsibilities. The inspection went smoothly until the inspectors reached the boiler room, the same place where the fire had started months earlier. When they opened the door, Samuel felt a pang of anxiety. He knew that any oversight in that area could ruin all the work they had done. However, as he checked every valve and pipe, the inspectors nodded with satisfaction. "Everything's in order," they said, signing the necessary documents to approve the renovations. Samuel felt a deep sense of relief, but what truly impacted him was the expression on Henry's face when he came over to congratulate him. "You did a good job, Samuel," he said, without a trace of sarcasm or condescension. They were simple words, but loaded with a weight Samuel hadn't experienced in a long time: respect. Henry, the man who had doubted him from the beginning, was finally acknowledging his effort. Alice also approached quietly, placing a hand on her son's shoulder. She didn't say anything, but her look said it all. She was proud of him, not for what he had done, but for the person he was becoming. That moment was a small triumph, but for Samuel, it meant more than any material success he had chased in the past. Despite the success of the inspection, Samuel knew challenges still lay ahead. He had earned the trust of some tenants, but the path to complete reconciliation with his mother and himself was long and winding. However, for the first time in his life, he didn't feel rushed to reach the end of the road. Each day was a new opportunity to be better, and that simple truth was more valuable than anything he had sought in his youth. The building, under Alice and Henry's management, had transformed into a welcoming home for all its residents. The common areas thrived with the life of children playing and neighbors chatting. Samuel, although still living in the basement, felt he had finally found his place in the world. He was no longer the greedy son who only thought of his own benefit. He was now a man who understood the value of honest work, sacrifice, and unconditional love. The night after the inspection, Samuel sat in the small courtyard of the building, watching the neighborhood lights flicker in the distance. Alice joined him, carrying 2 cups of tea. "It's a good start," she said softly, as she handed him one of the cups. Samuel nodded, knowing that his mother's words weren't just about the inspection, but about the new life he was building. "Thank you for not giving up on me," Samuel murmured, his voice choked with emotion. Alice looked at him tenderly, placing a hand over his. "I always knew there was more to you than ambition," she replied with a serene smile. "You just needed time to find it." That night, as the moon shone over the renovated building, Samuel understood that true success wasn't found in luxuries or the approval of others, but in being someone he could be proud of. And although he knew there were still wounds to heal, for the first time in his life, he was willing to do what it took to earn his mother's forgiveness and love. The following months marked a new chapter in Samuel's life, but also in Alice's. With the building fully operational and the neighbors enjoying a renovated space, the atmosphere was one of optimism. However, the relationship between mother and son was still in the healing process. Although they now worked together for the well-being of the community, both knew the wounds of the past remained open and needed time to heal. Samuel continued living in the basement, but this time with a clear purpose. He didn't want to leave that place until he had proven he could be worthy of his mother's trust. Each day was another step toward his redemption, and although there were still difficult moments, Samuel was learning to accept his mistakes with humility. It was no longer just about making amends for the harm he had caused, but about rebuilding himself from within and finding his true identity. Alice, for her part, watched her son with a mix of hope and caution. She had seen Samuel genuinely change, but she knew that the path to forgiveness couldn't be forced. She needed time to heal the scars he had left her. However, every small effort Samuel made touched her deeply. The way he helped the neighbors, the extra hours he dedicated to maintaining the building, and how he treated others with respect and kindness. The most significant change occurred between Samuel and Henry. Their relationship, which had initially been marked by distrust, blossomed into a true friendship. Samuel had learned to value Henry's discipline and honesty, and Henry, in turn, found in Samuel a man willing to redeem himself. The two worked side by side in managing the building, and their conversations, once tense, became warm and filled with mutual respect. One afternoon, Henry proposed that Samuel take on more responsibilities in the building's administration. "It's time for you to start building something for yourself," he said, handing him a folder with tenant documents and the building's finances. "I trust you to do it well." Those words meant more than Samuel could express, and he accepted the responsibility with gratitude. Little by little, Samuel became a pillar within the building community. The neighbors, who had initially viewed him warily, began to trust him. He helped Marta find a better job and organized activities for the building's children. He accompanied Don Agustin to the doctor and fixed issues without anyone asking him. Every small act of kindness was another brick in the reconstruction of his new life. However, Samuel knew the most important moment was still to come: the final reconciliation with his mother. Although Alice had shown signs of hope, complete forgiveness had yet to be granted. Samuel understood he couldn't force it. He needed to wait patiently, proving day by day that he had truly changed. One day, while finishing up the financial documents for the building, Alice entered the office. She wore a calm but determined expression, as if she had made an important decision. Samuel immediately stood up, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. However, before he could say anything, Alice looked directly at him and spoke in a soft but firm voice. "Samuel," she began, "I know the road to get here hasn't been easy for either of us, but I want you to know that I'm seeing the man you're becoming, and that man is someone I can start to feel proud of." Alice's words struck Samuel's heart with unexpected force. For so long, he had dreamed of hearing those words, but he had never believed the moment would come when he truly deserved them. Alice stepped closer to her son and took his hands in hers. "I can't erase the past," she continued, but I can choose the future I want to have with you. And what I want is for us to build that future together, as a family." Samuel, unable to contain his emotion, felt tears slide down his face. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to be vulnerable in front of his mother. "I'm sorry, Mum," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry for hurting you and making you feel less. There are no excuses for what I did, but I want you to know that I'll never fail you again." Alice hugged him tightly, and in that embrace, the beginning of a new stage in their lives was sealed. It wasn't a complete forgiveness, but it was a firm step toward the reconciliation they both needed. The days that followed were filled with significant moments. Samuel left the basement and moved into a small apartment in the same building, close to his mother. Although they still lived independently, they shared dinners together several times a week, talking about their days and reminiscing about the good times they had shared in the past. The mother-son relationship that had been broken for so long was beginning to rebuild with care and love. The building, under their joint management with Henry, thrived more than ever. The neighbors felt part of a strong and united community, and Samuel, who had once scorned that way of life, realized that he needed nothing more to be happy. For the first time in his life, he understood that true value was not in luxuries or social recognition, but in authentic relationships and a sense of belonging. One night, Alice and Samuel sat in the building's lobby, watching the children play in the courtyard and the neighbors chat animatedly. "This is the home I always wanted for us," Alice said quietly. Samuel smiled, feeling that he was finally where he belonged. "Thank you for giving me a second chance, Mom," Samuel murmured, keeping his eyes on the scene unfolding before them. Alice smiled, placing a hand over his. "I always knew there was a good man inside you, Samuel. It just needed time to find him." The road to redemption hadn't been easy, and both knew there would still be difficult moments in the future. But now they walked together, as a family that had learned to forgive and love each other, despite past mistakes. And that, Samuel thought, was the greatest treasure he could have found. The building, once a place of conflict and pain, had transformed into a home full of life and hope. And at the heart of that home were Alice and Samuel, rebuilding their relationship day by day, step by step, toward a future where love and forgiveness would be the cornerstones of their new life. Thank you for joining us on this story of redemption, love, and second chances. If you found it inspiring, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Remember, it's never too late to change and rebuild what's been lost. See you in the next story.